What is your most valuable possession? All right, here's a follow-up question that's not on the screen. How do you define value? Most of the time when we think about value, we think about money, we think about cost, more than we think about people. As we've been going through this series, we've kind of had this one idea that's thread through the entire thing, and that idea has been trust. And God has been asking this question, what do we value? And he's been asking, do you trust me? He's been asking the Israelites over and over again, do you trust me? Do you value me? And he's been asking us the same thing. So we're wrapping up our Milk and Honey series. We started on May 20th. It's been a while ago. And we've been walking through the wilderness journey of Moses, the Israelites, as they left slavery in Egypt. They crossed through the Red Sea. They wandered around the wilderness. They rejected God's calling to the promised land and then spent the next 39 years wandering around in circles while God faithfully guided them, fed them, gave them water. And then last time we were here, 2 weeks ago, Moses' journey ended atop Mount Nebo, standing beside God, staring out at the promised land. And it says that he dies. And then Kayla texts me in the middle of my sermon, or close to the end of my sermon, saying that Moses was 120 years old, and it said that he was healthy. God took that joker out. So God took Moses' life at 120 years old. He was healthy. It said that he didn't have any health problems, but his time was up. So this entire time, it had been about Moses and the people learning to trust God over temporary things. And repeatedly, they failed. Every time we saw that they had failed. God had been faithful, showing them mercy and grace, continually leading them through the wilderness. An entire generation of people had to die. And now their children are grown. These people had never experienced the slavery of Egypt. They had only seen God's faithfulness in the wilderness. How do you think they're going to respond in the text that we read tonight? Do you think they're going to follow in the footsteps of their parents? Let's find out. So we're going to spend the majority of our time in Joshua chapter 1 through Joshua chapter 4, but for us to keep everything in context, we have to start in Deuteronomy chapter 34 and see what happens at the end of the chapter. So the first point for tonight is going to be called a final call to trust. So again, this entire series, God has been calling the people of Israel to trust him. And so this is their last chance. It's the final opportunity for them to trust. So after Moses' death, there's this transition of power. So we read last time that Moses dies on top of Mount Nebo, and it says that God himself buries Moses, and people still cannot find his body. That God buries him, and that he dies a faithful servant. So picking up in verse 9, Joshua son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. There's already a shift in the text. It goes from an entire generation of people who are disobedient, who complained, to as soon as Joshua takes over, there's an immediate shift of how the people are following. So no, they don't follow in the footsteps of their parents. They completely change what they're going to do. So first we see that there's a new leader. So continuing, it starts talking about Moses again. It talks about how the people are going to follow the command of God, follow the command of Joshua. And then verse 10, no prophet had arisen again in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unparalleled for all the signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do against the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh, to all of his officials, and to all of his land, and for all the mighty acts and power and terrifying deeds that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. Here's the thing, the text tells us Moses is gone. The people mourn him, but Joshua inherits the people. He becomes their new leader. Joshua was not called to lead like Moses. He is a completely different man. He was not called to perform the same signs and miracles that Moses did, but to lead in a different way. These were not the same people that followed Moses through the Red Sea. They were not the same people that followed God through the wilderness, that entire early generation. This was a new generation. They were familiar with Joshua. Joshua was one of the 12 spies who scoped out the promised land back in Numbers 13 and 14. And he was one of only 2 who gave a good report and encouraged them, hey, we can take the land. We can do exactly what God has told us to do. He was brave. He trusted God, and he was ready to take over. The verses also said that Joshua was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. That was a sign of leadership being transferred from one person to another. So Moses had also given him his stamp of approval, so to speak. The reaction of the people not only showed that Joshua was ready to lead, but the people were also ready to follow. This is the first instance that we see the people were willing to follow without complaint. So not only was there a new leader, but also it was the same God. So even though the people were given a new leader, they were still tasked with trusting the same God. God was the one who promised the inheritance to Abraham. He preserved Moses in the Nile. He heard their prayers of his people in Egypt. He called Moses out of Midian, freed the people from slavery, led them into the wilderness and through the wilderness, provided for them every day for 40 years, and is now, again, he has them on the brink of the promised land and is calling them to trust him one more time. This time, things are different. The people are not complaining. They're not begging for a new leader. They're not crying about wanting to die in the wilderness. This time, they're saying, yes, we will follow. We will go where you want us to. They are trusting God, and they are trusting the man that God has put in charge. So there's this shift from this complaining attitude to this faithful trust. And so we see that they're finally appreciating the milk. They're appreciating the temporary. Do you guys remember the original definition that we had for milk? I've repeated it, I think, in every lesson that we've had. The temporary things in life that we may depend on. That's what the milk is. That's what the entire previous generation had been focused on. That's what their trust had been on. And we even saw in Moses' case, the last time that we had our lesson, that he even still had his roots dug in the fact that his temper was still trusting in the things that he held on to prior to him being called by God to go to free his people, by the way he reacted to the people. So these temporary things that we may depend on. So the struggle that Israel had this entire time is that their faith, their trust was in these temporary things. They saw Egypt as a fallback plan when things got hard. We have fallback plans. When you guys start looking at colleges, you're probably going to apply to multiple. You're going to have your number one college. I want to go to this college, but here's a fallback plan. When you apply to jobs, you're going to apply to multiple jobs. This is the job I really want, but here's a fallback plan in case I don't get that job. Here's a girl I really like, but I might date this one in case she tells me no. Like y'all have never done that before. Girls probably have done that with guys. But we want to have a backup plan just because we don't want to get caught with egg on our face or we don't want to look bad. But this is what Israel had done the entire time. They thought Egypt, if things went south, they could complain enough and God would just let them go back to Egypt. We do the same thing with our faith. We keep one eye on God while we're looking back at our life of sin, thinking, maybe I can just go back to how I used to live. The world looks attractive enough that I can say, hey, I can follow Jesus, but I can just creep back. I can still be saved, but I can still live like the world. I can still be saved and to go to heaven, but I can still live like hell. This is the first time in Israel's history that they have finally realized that these temporary things are only holding them back from where God is trying to get them to go. Not necessarily that they're bad, but they are not the ultimate thing. They complained because the temporary things were not good enough. They were not lasting long enough. This milk, the bottle is bending, it is growing because that milk is over a month past due. If you were to drink that milk right now, it would make you sick. On May 27th, it would be tolerable. A week before that, you would drink it and it would nourish your body. Right now, it would make you sick and maybe even put you in the hospital. These temporary things that God gives us that we depend on are meant to be temporary, not to hold on to and to clutch onto because they will eventually spoil. And that's what Israel has been doing up until this point. They saw Egypt as a fallback plan when things got hard. They only saw the lack of food and water, but couldn't see the God who provided for them, even though he guided them every day. They only saw the giants in the promised land, but not the God who promised them victory. Again, after 40 years, after a generation had passed, the people finally saw that the milk was meant to be a gift, but not the goal. It was not the finish line. So they finally had the proper position. Joshua 1 through 18, if we look at verses 1 through 9, it mirrors the same promise. And I'll just go ahead and tell you this. There's several instances in these chapters that mirror earlier stories in the journey of the Israelites. This is what I find most interesting about the first 4 or 5 chapters of Joshua. It literally mirrors what happens with the earlier generation and how this generation does it correctly. If you've got time to read through the whole chapters and go back and look at what the first generation does, you'll be able to pick up on a lot more of these nuances and a lot more of these things. We've only got about 16 more minutes, so we don't have time to read through everything. But go back and read it all. Go back and look at the previous lessons we've done and see how this generation has done it correctly. But I'll give you the Cliff Notes, or whatever you guys use now. But Joshua 1 through 9 mirrors the same promise that God gives the people in Leviticus 26. And when Caleb states in Numbers 13 that God is with us, the victory is ours. This generation, instead of repeating the failure of their fathers, they trusted God and trusted Joshua and followed his command. Then in verses 10 through 15, Joshua reminds them again, tribe by tribe, that God is going to be with them and that they need to be prepared to move. The fighting is not done until every tribe has the land that God has given them. They all have to be united as one. They cannot run off and do their own thing. They have got to fight together. 16 through 18, the people respond. They're no longer looking back at how good they had it in Egypt or in the wilderness. They're not begging to die. They respond this: everything you have commanded us, we will do. And everywhere you send us, we will go. We will obey you just as we obeyed Moses and everything. I think they're embellishing a little bit there. Certainly the Lord your God will be with you as he was with Moses. Anyone who rebels against your order and does not obey your words and all that you command him will be put to death. Above all, be strong and courageous. So these people go from a generation that was rebellious and where God was killing left and right, to now they're saying, if anyone in our group is disobedient, we will kill them ourselves. A complete change of character, a complete change of direction. They are so sold out to God and to Joshua that they're willing to do whatever it takes to accomplish the mission that God has given them. They do not want to repeat the sins of their fathers. They're no longer placing themselves as the kings of their lives. They're no longer trying to do what is best for themselves. They're able to trust someone other than themselves. They tried at trusting themselves. They saw their fathers failed over and over again trusting themselves. They decided to reject that, and instead they submitted their trust to God and the one that God put in charge of them. They had seen God be faithful to them their entire lives. Many of them had seen in the person their fathers failed when God led them to the promised land the first time, and they were not about to make that same mistake. Some of them were kids, probably younger than you, when their fathers denied obedience and God told them to go into the promised land. They told God no. And they had to live with that decision the rest of their lives, or for the next 39 years, and watch their fathers die in the wilderness. And they were not going to repeat that mistake. They understood that the blessing that God gave them, or the blessings, were meant to be temporary. They were meant to build trust that led to God himself, not to trust the things. So the men, the leaders, were willing to follow God and follow Joshua. What happens in Joshua 2 makes this even more interesting and shows how the sons learned from the father's mistakes. So it gave them a correct perspective. So Joshua 2, 1 through 24. I've got a couple magnifying glasses. They're in my book bag. You guys know how magnifying glasses work? So magnifying glasses work in a very specific way. And I've learned that more than likely, if I were to take my contacts out, it would probably be very close to my actual prescription. That's how bad my vision is. But you see how it magnifies my eyeballs? Yes. For it to work correctly, you have got to hold it a particular way for it to magnify the paper. So you can see it, and you hold it away from it to make it bigger. You have to have the correct perspective for it to work the way that it's supposed to work. It makes things bigger. But if they're not used correctly, it distorts what you're looking at. Instead of it making it look bigger, it makes it blurry. It distorts the image. It's almost like one of those carnival mirrors where it makes you look really tall or really skinny or really fat or really short, whatever. It works in a way that it was not designed to work. So you have to look at the lens correctly or else it's not going to do what it was designed to do. If we were to revisit the spies that were scoping out the promised land in Numbers 13 and 14, they spoke of the people being like giants and them seeing themselves like grasshoppers. This time, the two spies that Joshua sends actually speaks to Rahab is in Jericho, and they actually hear the perspective of the people. In Numbers 13 and 14, the people make up the perspective. They say the giants are looking at us like we are grasshoppers. They didn't actually go and talk to the people, but they projected what they thought the people thought about them. How many of us are guilty of looking at someone and they're making a face and we think, oh, they hate us because they're looking at us weird? We jump to conclusions like we ought to be starting in the NBA. Yes, Kayla looks at me all the time because I do not have a smiley face whenever I'm thinking. Someone asked me at camp. I was thinking deeply and I had a face that looked like I was scowling. They're like, are you okay? I was like, yes, I'm just thinking about something. I don't look friendly from a distance. It's just how my face rests. But people jump to conclusions because they look at something, when in reality, if you were just to go up and talk to that person, you would learn something completely different. But what the Israelites did, because they were looking for a reason to disobey God, they created a reason. You find what you're looking for. And that's what they did in Numbers 13 and 14. In this instance, the two spies, they go into Jericho, they talk to Rahab, and they find out the truth. They're looking through the correct lens. They have the correct perspective. Let's look at verses 9 through 13 in chapter 2. This is Rahab speaking. I know that the Lord has given you this land and that the terror of you has fallen on us. The people in Jericho are scared to death, for we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt. This happened over 40 years ago. So they have been terrified for over 40 years while they have been aimlessly wandering around the wilderness thinking that they were going to kill them. These people were shaking in their boots. They were scared, terrified, waiting for them to come and kill them. And what you did to Sihon and Og, the two Amorite kings, you completely destroyed across the Jordan. When we heard this, we lost heart. One translation says their hearts literally melted. That's how scared they were. And everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. So Rahab has rejected her own gods that she believed in and now believes in the God of heaven because of the stories she has heard of what God has done for these people who have been unfaithful. But because she is so terrified of what their God has done and the stories she has heard, she has rejected her own gods and honestly betrayed her own people. But these people were too big of cowards and too disobedient to not trust God that they're just waiting on the Israelites to come and kill them. But because they had the wrong perspective, they were not willing to trust God and actually go in and do what God called them to do. And so she continues in verse 12, now please swear to me by the Lord that you will also show kindness to my father's family, because I showed kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father, mother, brothers, sisters, and all who belong to them, and save us from death. This tells us something completely different from the 10 spies that we see in Numbers 13 and 14. They knew that God was giving them the land and were terrified. The people in Jericho, the people in Canaan, they knew that God was coming. They knew the Israelites were coming. It was only a matter of time. But the Israelites did not trust God. They knew they were going to be destroyed. But the Israelites did not have enough faith, did not trust God enough to take that step. They heard what God had done in Egypt, the Red Sea, the other nations that were completely destroyed, and it caused them to acknowledge that the God of the Israelites was the one true God. Because these men were willing to trust God, these two spies, it led them to have the proper position, which corrected their perspective, seeing that God had already made the people of Jericho aware that God's people were coming to claim the land. It was no longer giants in the land that led the Israelites to fear. But look at verse 24 in chapter 2. The Lord has handed, this is their report to Joshua, and what Joshua relays to the people. The Lord has handed over the entire land to us. Everyone who lives in the land is also panicking because of us. They are running scared because they know that they're about to die. Every provision that God had made had been fulfilled. Every promise that God had made was coming true. The people were finally trusting not the milk, but rather God. And because of this, they were ready to embrace the honey, the eternal. They were ready to embrace God himself. So point 3 is embracing the honey. Before the people could ever take possession of the promised land, they had one more step that they had to take. There was one more boundary they had to cross. Do you guys remember the definition that we had for honey? The lasting promise and fulfillment found in God. So not the promises and fulfillment of God, but the promises and fulfillment found in God. So it is God himself. So what we see in Joshua chapter 3 and chapter 4 are two things. First of all, in chapter 3, what we see is that God is leading the way. Joshua 3 reflects back to the crossing of the Red Sea. God splits the Jordan River in a miraculous way so that the people can cross. The Ark of the Covenant, which represents the presence of God, leads the way, carried by the priest to the middle of the Jordan River. Joshua tells the people, consecrate yourself, purify yourselves, make sure you are holy before you ever set foot in the Jordan River. And then stay about 1,000 yards back behind the Ark of the Covenant. Don't go near it because you haven't gone this way before. You are stepping onto new ground. This is uncharted territory for you. Joshua also makes the point that the river was flooded. It was unsafe. It is the highest that it usually is throughout the year. So there was no way that anyone could cross it. They couldn't swim across it because they would drown. Very similar to where the Red Sea was whenever they were going to have to cross it. If it was not for God, the people would not be able to cross the river at all. So there was nothing they could do themselves to get across this barrier. So Joshua then tells the priests are going to lead the way with the Ark of the Covenant. As soon as their bare feet hit the banks of the Jordan River, God splits the Jordan River, and dry ground comes, just like with the Red Sea. But this time the priests only go halfway. They go directly to the middle of the Jordan River. So we see in this moment in Joshua 4 that the temporary meets the eternal. So chapter 4 is where a lot of this stuff starts happening. God tells Joshua to get one man from each tribe to take a stone from the middle of the Jordan River, to carry it on his shoulder and put it where they will spend the night. Now, why would they need to put a stone on their shoulder? Could they just grab a pebble, just pick up a rock, carry it in their hand, take it down? Would it make sense to put a pebble on your shoulder? When he said grab a stone, how big of a stone do you think he was telling them to get? Have you ever watched the World's Strongest Man competition? Are y'all familiar with the Atlas stones? Throw up that picture, Jonah. This is what it made me think of. This is a competition in the Highland Games. Because this is part of the Highland Games, they're Scottish. This is not the Atlas stone, but this is similar to it. In the Highland Games, one of the things they have to do is they have to pick up this giant boulder or giant stone off the ground, and you have to pick it up in a very specific way. You have to go down and pick it up almost like a deadlift, and you pick it up and you have to rock back, and then you have to stand up like this, and then you have to kind of rock forward and come back and pull it up on your shoulder. You can't carry it like this because eventually you'll lean forward and you have to drop it. When he tells them to pick up this stone, he's not telling them just pick up any little stone or any pebble. They were commanded to grab a large stone. And when he's doing this, this may not be a one-to-one correlation, but it drives home the point that it's not meant to be something insignificant. He's not telling them just grab a rock so you can skip it across the Jordan River. He's telling them that you are going to grab the largest stone that you can possibly grab, and you are going to carry that stone to the edge of the Jordan River, and you are going to carry it on your shoulder so you can bear this burden, so that you can feel the weight of what is about to happen. With each step, the boulder feels heavier until they can't bear the burden anymore. These men that are having to carry this the farthest distance, the competition is they pick it up, and they go as far as they possibly can until they physically can't. They either fall down or they drop it. Jonah, Levi, and I went to a World's Strongest Man competition a few years ago in Myrtle Beach, and they have like a metal, I think it's shaped like the state of Texas or something. It's weird. But they picked it up, and we saw a guy have one against his chest, and he blacked out and fell down on top of it, and it bloodied him up. because of how heavy it was. Just showing you how heavy this is. But God tells Joshua to tell these one man from each tribe, pick up this stone and carry it over your shoulder, to emphasize the burden of preserving the testimony of God's faithfulness for future generations. He mentions it twice, verses 6 and 7, and then again in verses 21 through 23. This memorial is to remind you, also to tell your children, to tell future generations, and to show the world of God's faithfulness, that He is trustworthy. The land was not enough to remind people. We went to Montana back in April. The scenery was gorgeous, but after a few days, it just kind of blended in. The mountains were great, but after a few days, the mountains were just the mountains. You know, when you move to a new place or you have a new building, our youth space, a lot of you were in here before we made the renovations. And it was a massive transformation from what it used to look like. But now it's just kind of every day. We don't appreciate it as much as we used to because we've forgotten what it looks like. But what God has done with these men by making them bear this burden, by telling them to constantly remind yourself, remind your children, remind foreigners, remind the world of my faithfulness, is that it constantly brings it back to their attention. This is what I've done for you. He doesn't say, look at the promised land and see what I've done. He doesn't say, look at the homes that I've given you. Look at the fruit that you have. Look at the family that you have. He says, no, go back to this point. Go back to the Jordan River where this monument has been built to remind you of my faithfulness. And this monument will point you back to me. Not to the rocks, not to the things I've done, but to me. Point you to eternity, to who I am. The land was not enough to remind people. This memorial was not about the rocks, but rather the God who did it. Joshua also created a second memorial. I had never realized this, and the many times I've read through Scripture, I did not notice this until I studied this in depth over the last couple of months. In verse 9, it says that Joshua created a second stack in the middle of the Jordan River. The river has times throughout the year to where it floods and then also where it's shallow. Either way, the stones Joshua set up in the middle of the Jordan River would remain, whether they could see it or not. And maybe this is a reminder to them that even when they can't see God working, He still is. That when the water is shallow, they can see that God is there, but when the river is flooded, they know that even when they can't see it, that God is still there and that God is still working. For Israel to make this step, it means that they had to let go of their grip, their grasp on the temporary. They had to realize that the milk was never going to fulfill them. Augustine of Hippo, who was one of our early church fathers, he explains it like this: you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. The Israelites were never going to be satisfied until they realized that the temporary things, the milk, was never going to fulfill the eternal soul within them. God has made them and made us the same way. While we are flesh or blood, we are created for eternity. There are things in this world that may make us happy for a time. They may make us numb. They may make us forget, make us feel a temporary satisfaction, but it is never going to fulfill us for eternity. It was never meant to do that. God has given us temporary things for that very purpose, to be temporary. Every good thing that you have in your life, God has given you to point to Himself, to remind you that He is there, that He is drawing you to Himself. We make the same mistake that the people of Israel did when we elevate those temporary things to where only God should be. It's so easy to do this because it's right in front of us. We can touch it, we can feel it, we can see it, we can hear it, we can remember it. But those things will eventually fade, but only God remains. If our faith is in the things of this world, it will only last as long as the world does. And when the world fades and eternity remains, we have nothing left. God calls us to eternity. He calls us to embrace the honey, to embrace Himself. He has provided the way to Himself, and that is only through Christ. That is through repentance, through salvation. It is the only way. Just like obedience to the Passover and walking through the Red Sea, then through the Jordan was the only way to get to the Promised Land. The only way to God is through Christ and what He has done. We cannot do it ourselves, and there's nothing temporary, nothing that this world can provide that will get us to God. So we started this series in lesson 1. I asked you guys a question. I said, what do you depend on? And I want to finish with a similar question. After this study, walking through God, gracefully testing the Israelites again and again, showing them mercy, showing them grace, revealing himself to them and giving them one last opportunity, leading to them learning to trust him. I want to leave you with this question before I pray. Who do you depend on?